The Women's March on Washington, rallies and riots on college campuses, and now protests against guns. Don't expect demonstrations like these to go away anytime soon. Joining us to explain why is Dr. Charles Derber. He's professor of sociology at Boston College and author of the book, Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times. So, Dr. Derber, without beating around the bush here, how would you say that these demonstrations, even riots and violence in some instances, differ from what we experienced in the 60s and 70s? I mean, some people would say they're tearing away the fiber of American democracy, and I'm sure other nations wouldn't even tolerate such behavior.
I think because people since the 1960s have felt increasingly disenfranchised, understanding that government is being driven by a small cadre of people, as the Occupy Wall Street movement called it, the 1%, who don't share their general interests, and people feel very disenchanted. Under those conditions, the main way that people have an opportunity to express themselves when they feel that the electoral process is failing them and that the structures of power that kind of dominate both policy and discourse are being taken away from popular will, is to get out on the streets and express yourself. And I think Trump's election kind of created a trigger point. It was not so much that Trump was bringing something fundamentally new. It was simply that his election and some of the oddities and fear associated with it simply triggered what was really a decades-old sort of set of popular malaise, discomfort, economic decline. The Women's March was arguably the largest day of protest in the United States and in the world. We had about 5 million people, and not just in the United States, although there were millions in the United States, but in Europe and around the world. When you speak of violence, what's characteristic of this resistance, which is most hopeful, is that it's overwhelmingly nonviolent. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of problems.
But I know on the day of the inauguration and then later on at Berkeley in California, Antifa and others turned very violent. They smashed windows, they beat people up. I mean, obviously you're not talking about that, are you?
No. I mean, I think that, you mention these things probably partly because these things get a lot of attention in the media. I mean, violence, unfortunately, one of the ways people feel they get attention is by smashing windows or whatever. This is a very, very, very small percentage. But let me just tell you the core idea of my book, which is that the resistance and sort of progressive movements generally, probably since the Reagan Revolution or since even the 60s. In the 60s, you had a figure like Martin Luther King, a spiritual figure who started as a civil rights activist and sort of, I think, could rally much of the country, but not all. But anyway, the violence there was obviously by people in the South who did not want to see segregation and so forth. And, King was violently attacked and killed when he finally made the connection between, on the one hand, civil rights, secondly, the Vietnam War, sort of like a process of connecting the dots. This is part of the history of resistance, so that people rise up against a particular thing that they feel very passionate about. It could be racism, it could be protection of religious rights, it could be women's rights, it could be poverty.
With social media, there are many voices. It seems like we're very polarized. What needs to be done?
If you ask what can unify the country, I mean, I think in one way is to recognize that the discontent on both the left and the right has some common origins and common roots, which I've already talked about, which is this sort of loss of control. I mean, Trump talked about wanting to drain the swamp. I don't think he's doing that, but that was his message for the forgotten people as he talked about them. And on the left, Bernie Sanders and people who are in the resistance themselves feel like they've been left out in some way, and that the Democratic Party is not speaking for them as well as the Republican Party, because both parties have been taken over by what Trump called the swamp, by which he meant lobbyists, people with a lot of money who are not speaking for the needs of ordinary people.
Well, it seems like that's where left and right can agree and come together. I guess maybe the solutions that's where they may differ. But we're out of time, Dr. Charles Derber, professor of sociology at Boston College. We thank you so much for sharing your perspective today.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Gary.